Dear viewers, subscribers, and the students, welcome to the IAS Mentor. We are in lecture number 4 of the series Indian Polity, and we are in the topic historical background. As I've already said, this series will be immensely useful to the students preparing for UPSC IAS examination, and not only for the students preparing for UPSC IAS examination, but those who are preparing for any competitive examination. So let us just take a moment to understand as to what we have seen and understood till this point of time before I get into today's lecture, that is the historical background. We have already started the topic of historical background, but if you look into the first topic that you have understood, we have tried to understand as to what is a constitution. And from there, I'll just take a couple of minutes and then we'll proceed to today's topic. So what is a constitution? A constitution is nothing but a fundamental rule book based on which the country is governed. And today India is governed as per the Constitution of India. And we also understood that this constitution that we have got today, based on which our country is governed, was drafted by a specific body. And that body is nothing but the Constituent Assembly, which was established based on the recommendation of the Cabinet Mission Plan in 1946. And this body almost took 3 years, and then they drafted the Constitution of India, and that came into force on 26th January 1950. That is also what we celebrate as the Republic Day. But however, we have seen that this Constituent Assembly did not come on one particular day. That means it came and it was established on a particular day, but there was a long series of events that led to establishment of the Constituent Assembly, and for which we'll have to understand as to what kind of historical developments or historic background has happened over a period of time. Because it is also true that if you look into the history of India, India was governed by the Britishers for almost 200 years, or in other words, India was ruled by Britishers for almost 200 years. In the last lecture, I gave this introduction that the Britishers came somewhere in the end of 17th century, and initially almost for the first 150 years, they just were traders in India. They were just doing business in India, and because their business was very profitable. But however, after 150 years, after they have entered into India, they also thought that there is an opportunity for them to politically control India. So they engage in some of the wars, especially after the Battle of Plassey and the Battle of Buxar. The Britishers who came and established East India Company, which was merely a company, now started taking political control over India, which means they also tried to dominate the administration in India, started collecting taxes in India, they started having army in India, and that is when the British Parliament tried to regulate the affairs of East India Company. In fact, some Britishers came to India and they established a company, and that came to be what is called as East India Company. But however, once they started having political control over India, the British Parliament, in the name of the Crown, they thought that they should regulate the affairs of East India Company. And that is when they passed what is called as the Regulating Act of 1773. And through the Regulating Act of 1773, they tried to regulate the affairs of the East India Company. And in the last class itself, I have said that who is considered to be the CEO of this East India Company or the executive officer is none other than the governor of the Bengal. So he is considered to be the CEO of the East India Company. He was also designated as the Governor General of Bengal. And they also tried to regulate certain other affairs of the East India Company, because at the time there was a lot of corruption that was happening in East India Company. So this Regulating Act also restricted the company officials from getting local gifts and all those things. And they also established majorly what is called as a Supreme Court in Calcutta in order to administer justice to the people in the local area. So these are all the major development that has happened. But however, this Regulating Act also mandated that the company should report to the British Crown with regard to the administration in British India. But however, this Regulating Act has led to some conflict between what is called as the Governor General and his Council versus the authority of the Supreme Court. In order to resolve the Governor General and his council versus the Supreme Court, the conflict, what has been done is the amending act of the act of settlement or the amending act was passed in 1781, and they tried to resolve the conflict between the Supreme Court and the Governor General Council. So in the last class itself, I explained as to what is this Governor General Council. What is this Governor General Council? The Governor General Council is nothing but, while the Governor General is the Chief Executive Officer, he is having certain executive members who will advise him in carrying out various duties and responsibilities with regard to the administration of the company and thereby administration of British India. So the Amending Act of 1781 or the Act of Settlement has resolved these disputes, and in a way they have given more powers to the Governor General. Especially the Amending Act said that in case of the official actions performed by the company officials, the court will not have any authority to look into those official acts. And in case of administration of justice to the local people in India, the administration has to be done based upon the personal laws, not upon the English laws. So these are all some of the changes and problems that has been rectified. But then came the Pitt's India Act very quickly. If you see the Pitt's India Act, it is a Pitt's India Act that established what is called as a dual system of government or dual system of administration. Now, before the Pitt's India Act, it was the Court of Directors who will have control over the Governor General and his Executive Council. So, who is this Court of Directors? I have already said this Court of Directors are the major stakeholders of the company. So, they would have control over the Governor General and his Council, both in terms of their political functions, or that is their administrative and political functions, and also in terms of their commercial functions. Because the company was supposed to do two functions. They have to carry out business also, that is one vertical, and then they are supposed to carry out political and administrative functions in British India. But in both the cases, the Governor General and his Council would report to the Court of Directors. Before Pitt's India Act, Pitt's the youngest Prime Minister of Britain, thought that this system is not effective, and hence we will establish what is called as an other body, which is also what is called as Board of Control. So he differentiated the functions between the Court of Directors and the Board of Control. So the Court of Directors would direct the Governor General and his Executive Council in carrying the commercial duties or the commercial responsibilities. But whereas the Board of Control would direct the Governor General and his Executive Council in carrying out what is called as the political and the administrative functions. While the Court of Directors are nothing but they are the major stakeholders of the company, while the Board of Control consists of the British Cabinet Ministers in England and along with that certain members of Parliament in the Britain. So they are all part of what is called as Board of Directors, and they would direct the Governor General and Executive Council in performing the political and the administrative functions. So Pitts thought that this would bring in efficiency in the system of administration of the East India Company. And then the next act is what is the Act of 1786. Very quickly, this act was brought in specifically to make Lord Cornwallis as the Governor General of Bengal. So Lord Cornwallis said, if I have to accept the governorship, I should be given certain powers or more powers, and especially he was asking for what is called as veto powers over the decision or veto powers over the advice that is given by the Governor General Executive Council. And apart from that, he also wanted to be the Commander-in-Chief of the army. So to that extent, the law was enacted and Cornwallis was appointed as the Governor General of Bengal. So this is what we have seen in the last class. So we'll just proceed further. We'll try to understand what are the subsequent legislations that has happened, what are the subsequent acts that has happened during the historical background, especially during what is called as the Company Act. In fact, I said in the very beginning, the Britishers ruled India for 200 years. But in the first 100 years almost, it was also called as the company rule. And the next 100 years, it was what is called as the crown rule. That means for the first 100 years, the East India Company was the one which was taking care of the British India in the name of the British Crown. But whereas in the next 100 years almost, after 1857, right from 1858 to 1947, the British Crown directly took care of the administration in India, and that's basically what is called as the Crown Rule. That's a basic understanding we should have. So we are halfway in understanding the crown rule. So sorry, the company rule. So we'll proceed further. We'll try to understand the other development that has happened during what is called as the company rule. So there are four important developments subsequent to the Act of 1786. One is the Charter Act of 1793, and then the Charter Act of 1813, and then the Charter Act of 1833, and the Charter Act of 1853. So these are the four major developments that has happened after the Act of 1786. So basically, what does it mean by this Charter Act? Now, Charter Act basically gave the rights to the company to further carry out administration in India. In fact, initially when the East India Company came to India, when they came as traders, these traders came to India by the charter right that was granted by the Crown, the British Crown. Charter basically means a set of rights that is given to them to carry out trade in India. And that charter right was extended over a period of time. So it was extended in 1793 for another 20 years. And in 1813 it was again extended for another 20 years. And in 1833 again it was extended for another 20 years till 1853. So along with that extension of rights which was given to the East India Company by the British Crown, certain other reforms has also been brought in. So that is what basically we are trying to understand as to what kind of reforms has been brought in along with the Charter Acts. So look into the first Charter Act, that is the Charter Act of 1793. So if you see the Charter Act of 1793, the Charter Act of 1793 allowed the East India Company to carry out administration in India for another 20 years. Both in terms of the commercial functions as well as in terms of the political and administrative functions. But at the same time, along with that, certain marginal changes has also been made in the way that the country is to be administered by the East India Company. What are the marginal changes? It extended the power that was given to Cornwallis to all the other future Governor Generals. In fact, what was the power that was given to the Governor General of when Cornwallis was appointed as a Governor General? Cornwallis was given the power to veto the decision that was given by the Executive Council. So similar power was extended to the other future Governor Generals as well, and also to the governors of other presidencies. Say for example, apart from the Governor General of Bengal, there were Madras Province, there was Bombay Province, so there were other governors. So they also had their own council. So those governors are also having the power to veto the advice that was given by them. And most importantly, it continued what happened in the Regulating Act of 1773. In the Regulating Act of 1773 was a starting point of centralization of powers. That the power from the other governor generals or from the other governors were taken away and it was given to the governor of Bengal, and thereby he was designated as the Governor General of Bengal. So similarly, as and when the various acts progress, the Charter Act of 1793 also started enhancing or improving more of what is called as centralization. It started giving more powers again to the Governor General of Bengal. And in fact, one major development that has also happened during the Charter Act of 1793 is the Board of, so here you can understand, is majorly this Board of Control, and the staff members are to be paid from what? They are to be paid from the Indian revenues. I said the Pitt's India Act established a dual authority. One is what is called as the Court of Directors, and other is what is called as the Board of Control. This Board of Control, what was their responsibility is to direct the Governor General and his council with regard to the political and administrative functions. But who is to pay the Board of Directors and their staff members, support staff members? So the Charter Act of 1793 is saying that they have to be paid from the revenue of the company. That means it is going to increase the financial burden of the company. And the financial burden of the company means they have to tax it from the people of India. So ultimately, the tax burden laid upon the people of India. So these are the major changes that has happened during the Charter Act of 1793. And then I said that this Charter Act gave 20 years permission for the East India Company to administer India. And then subsequently, so that permission went till 1830. So in 1813, again the company sought for the permission from the British Crown to administer British India, and then again a permission was given by the British Crown for another 20 years. So the British Crown gave the permission. So this year again the permission was, this act again gave the permission for another 20 years. So this went on, this permission would go on till 1833. So that is basically what has happened by the Charter Act of 1833. But along with that, certain other changes have happened, certain important changes has happened in fact. And very, very important that you should remember this. It has been asked many times in the examination. It can very well be asked again in the prelims examination. In fact, one of the important change that has happened in the Charter Act of 1813 is, while the permission was given to the East India Company to carry out business as well as the political and administrative functions in India, but with regard to the commercial function, that is with regard to the trade activities, till that point of time the East India Company was having monopoly to trade with India. But the Charter Act of 1813 has taken away the monopoly rights of the East India Company to trade with India, and it has also allowed the other traders to trade in India except for certain areas. Let me just repeat it again, very, very important. What is one of the major change that has happened in the Charter Act of 1813? So 1813 has taken away the monopoly rights that was given to the East India Company to trade with India, except the trade with tea, trade in the area of tea and trade with China. The other areas, the right which was exclusively given to the East India Company has been taken away. That means other traders were also open to trade in India except in the area of tea and trade with China. Now, why these were restricted to East India Company? Because these two areas earned a lot of profit. So still these two areas were reserved for the East India Company, but other areas was open. So that's one major change that has happened. And another major change that has happened, this is also the beginning that the East India Company, or this is also the beginning where the Charter Act of 1813 has allowed the missionaries to enter into India and to do what is called as religious and educational activities. So this is the beginning where the Christian missionaries started coming into India and they carried out their own missionary activities, especially in the areas of spreading religion and educational awareness, educational purposes. They also started spreading education. These are the major changes that has happened in the Charter Act of 1813. So I said that Charter Act of 1813 gave permission for 20 years. So that permission continued till 1833. So 1833 again the company sought permission from the Crown to carry out the political and the administrative functions as well as the commercial functions in India. So again Charter Act of 1833 gave permission to the company for another 20 years to rule the British India on behalf of the British Crown. But this time there was a major change that has happened when this permission was given to the East India Company. What was the major change that has happened in the Charter Act of 1833? Now in Charter Act of 1813 itself we have seen that while the permission was given to the company to trade, but only in the areas of tea as well as trade with China, but that has also been done away with in the Charter Act of 1833. That means the Charter Act of 1833 gave permission to the company to continue their administration in British India, but they would not carry out any commercial activities. That means henceforth East India Company will not do any trading in India. It merely become, or it purely become, what is called as an administrative body. That is what you will have to understand. That means it is supposed to carry out only the political and administrative functions and henceforth no commercial functions. So that put an end to the trading activities of the company. So the East India Company would now become a purely an administrative authority. And because it became a purely an administrative authority, the Governor of Bengal was designated as a Governor General of Bengal. And who was first such Governor General of, the Governor General of Bengal was designated as the Governor General of India. And who was first such Governor General of India? It was Lord William Bentinck. So try to remember this. Many times has been asked in the examination. They can again ask you. So who was first such Governor General? It was Lord William Bentinck. And the era of centralization continued. So in a way, they kept on depriving the powers of the other presidencies and the governors of the other provinces. So this is what basically understood. So here also the centralization continued. So these are all some of the important changes that has happened in the Charter Act of 1833. But that is not the end of the story of the Charter Act of 1833. In fact, Charter Act of 1833 was also the beginning where the Governor General Council, that is the Governor General Executive Council, started meeting separately when they are performing legislative functions and started meeting separately when they are performing what is called as executive functions. Or in other words, the Governor General and he had certain council members. So they started meeting separately when they are doing what is called as legislative functions, that is law making functions. And they started meeting separately when they are performing what is called as the executive functions, which is majorly the implementation of the laws and the decisions. And in fact, when they are meeting for making the legislative functions, there was one law member who was also part of this particular council, and first such law member was Lord Macaulay. In fact, you will know this particular name probably. Lord Macaulay was very influential and he was one of the most important person related to codifying the laws in our country. Today, a lot of laws we follow in India, in independent India, had its roots in British India. So, for example, our criminal law even today, whatever we have, is majorly having its root from what has been codified by Lord Macaulay. So, he was part of the Governor General Council when it was performing the legislative function. So, that's one important development that has happened. And another important development that has happened in the Charter Act of 1833 is the Charter Act of 1833 also tried to introduce what is called as open competitive examination in our country. In fact, this is very, very important. When I say open competitive examination, it tried to introduce open competitive examination to recruit people to the East India Company, which is nothing but the administrative body. Now, this genesis or whatever has happened in 1833 is something we can call as the genesis of the present civil service examination in India. What is this East India Company? East India Company was an administrative authority to carry out administration in British India. And over a period of time, that turned out to be the governments and the bureaucrats who are to be part of the government. And what was initiated in 1833 was carried forward and things have gradually developed over a period of time. And today that has resulted in the kind of recruitment that happens with regard to what is called as civil service. And today the examination which you are preparing for, the civil service examination, is also on the basis of what is called as open competitive examination. And what is the genesis of all those things? It is a Charter Act of 1833. Now, why the Charter Act of 1833 wanted to bring in what is called as open competitive recruitment for the East India Company? Because that is the way they thought that they could bring in really meritorious people into the company and thereby they can carry out the administration effectively. Although it was intending to introduce this open competitive system of examination, but it could not materialize because there was stiff resistance from the Court of Directors. Who are the Court of Directors? I already said. Court of Directors are still the major stakeholders of this particular East India Company, which turned out to be an administrative body, but still there were major stakeholders to this company because when it was turned to be completely an administrative authority, and the Charter Act 1833 said that henceforth you don't have to carry out any commercial functions, but you purely act as an administrative body. And this act also compensated the Court of Directors because it is not carrying out any what? It is not carrying out any business activities, and which means it is a loss to the shareholders, the major shareholders of the company. And thereby this act says, so the directors would not lose anything, the Court of Directors, because some compensation will be provided to you because it is not carrying out the commercial activities. But from where this compensation is to be given, it is also to be given through the tax money that is collected from the British India, that is from the people of the British India. So that is why the critics also say this is the beginning of what is called as the drain of wealth. So more tax was imposed to compensate the Court of Directors because the commercial activities were done away with. So these are all some of the major developments that has happened in the Charter Act of 1833. So very quickly, what is the first thing? The Charter Act of 1833 put an end to what is called as their commercial activities, the company's commercial activities. And in fact, more centralization continued. And for the first time, the Governor General of Bengal was designated as the Governor General of India. And first such Governor General is none other than Lord William Bentinck. That's basically what you'll have to remember. And then apart from that, the Governor General Council also started meeting separately when they perform legislative function and when they perform what is called as legislative functions and executive functions. And when they perform legislative functions, a specific law member was also part of it, helping them in making better laws. And this Charter Act 1833 also tried to introduce what is called as open competitive examination for the recruitment of officials to East India Company, but it could not materialize because of stiff resistance from the Court of Directors, because the Court of Directors were selling these positions in the East India Company for high price. So they were not happy with bringing in open competitive system of examination. And ultimately you can say this is also the beginning of what is called as drain of wealth. And the last development that has happened in the series of development that has happened during the company rule is the Charter Act of 1853. So how the Charter Act of 1853 is different from the other Charter Acts? The first and foremost difference between the Charter Act of 1853 and the other Charter Act is the Charter Act of 1853 allowed the company to carry out administration in India. Of course, only the administrative functions, not the commercial functions. But for the first time, the Charter Act did not specify as to how long the company can carry out administration in India. If you look into the other Charter Acts till this point of time, every Charter Act was giving permission to the company to carry out administration for another 20 years. But Charter Act of 1853 did not specify anything. They said that in the name of the crown, you can just carry out the administration unless and until a law is made by the British Parliament in this particular regard. That means it's a clear indication that the British Parliament was not happy with the way that the East India Company is carrying out the administration. And it is also a clear indication that sooner or later the administration will be taken up directly by the British Crown. And that is what we call, when it was taken up by the British Crown, that was an era of what is called as Crown rule. After 1853, it continued till 1857. And you know that from 1858, the Crown has directly taken up the administration. So anyways, by 1853 Charter Act itself, it was more or less clear sooner or later, the administration of the British India will be directly taken up by the British Crown. So that is one understanding or one hint that was already available by the Charter Act of 1853. And another important development that has happened by the Charter Act of 1853 is this is the first time that the Governor General Executive Council separately functioned as what is called as a legislative council and separately functioned as what is called as a executive council. The difference between the Charter Act of 1833 and the Charter Act of 1853 is in Charter Act of 1833, the same members met separately with separate agenda. So the same members of the executive council in 1833, they had a separate agenda when they are performing as a legislative body. They had a separate agenda when they were performing as an executive body. But whereas in the Charter Act of 1853, that when they performed as a legislative body, there are a lot of new members who become part of it. And when they functioned as an executive body, only very limited members were part of it. That means when they functioned as a legislative body, this executive council, when they are doing the law making functions, a lot of new members become part of this council. That means the council was expanded when it was a legislative body. So thereby we can also say it is the Charter Act of 1853 was in some way the genesis of rudimentary parliamentary system that we have got today. So if at all any question comes, when did the rudimentary system of parliamentary system started during British India? It was by the Charter Act of 1853. So you can just keep this in your mind. So when they are performing the legislative functions as executive council, there were representatives from various provinces. There were representation from province of Madras, Bombay, Bengal, Agra, and all these areas. And they started participating when they are doing the law making functions, but not when they are performing the executive functions. So this one important development. And also the other major development is what was initiated in 1833, the Charter Act, to bring open competitive examination in the East India Company materialized by the Charter Act of 1853. By Charter Act of 1853, they started introducing and they also started performing recruiting to the East India Company through what is called as an open competitive system of examination. So these are all the major changes that has happened in the Charter Act of 1853. So if I have to quickly summarize what happened, for the first time the Act did not specify as to how long the East India Company would carry out administration. Without specifying any time limit, the East India Company would carry out administration. And further, the most important thing is that for the first time, the Governor General Council met separately for legislative functions and separately for executive functions with added extra members, a lot of extra members, which is little different from what I discussed in the Charter Act of 1833. And of course, this also allowed for what is called as open competitive examination. So the open competitive examination for the East India Company became a reality. And from there on, gradual development have happened in this particular process. And the same is what we have right now was the open competitive examination for civil service. So today the civil service recruitment that we have got in India is more or less a colonial legacy. Of course, things has been improvised. Things have gone for a change, but you can still see that it is nothing but the development of this open competitive examination, which was introduced in 1853. So when it was attempted in 1833, but when it became a reality, it became a reality in 1853. So these are all important areas. Whatever I ask, you will have to remember all these things, very, very important for your examination. Okay, so if you have an idea, today the recruitment for the civil service is carried out by one constitutional body. And can you tell me what is that constitutional body? If you know the name of the constitutional body, you can put it in the comment box. And those students who also know which article in the constitution provides for this constitutional body, you can also put the article in the comment box. Okay. So with that, we come to the summary of the company rule. That means what are the major outcome of the company rule, that is almost 100 years, starting 1773 to 1857, maybe a little less than 100 years. So what are the outcome, what are the basic key points that should take away overall, is that the entire era of company rule, starting 1773 to 1857, that was an era of what is called as centralization. That means gradually the administration was moving in a centralized manner. Starting the Regulating Act of 1773 till the Charter Act of 1853, it was more of what? It is more of what is called as centralization. And then you can also see the company which continued or which started as a commercial as well as a political authority merely become what is called as an administrative and a political authority, because the commercial functions of the company was taken away. And when it was taken away by the Charter Act of 1833. So that's another major development. And then gradually, when the Executive Council was functioning, both executive as well as legislative functions where they did not meet separately. So the same body which was performing both the functions, but gradually as and when the time progressed, they started doing both the functions separately. They started meeting separately as a legislative as well as executive body. And this is also the time where the merit-based examination started, which was initiated in 1833, become a reality in 1853 Charter Act. And one most important development, this was also the genesis of what is called as the codification of laws. In fact, Lord Macaulay, who was a law member in the Viceroy, or I would say the Governor General Legislative Council, so he played an influential role in codification of laws in British India during this point of time. So these are all the major development that has happened over a period of time. So now let us go to the practice question. Have a look into the practice question. And I'm very sure that if you have observed my lecture clearly, you will be in a position to answer this particular question. Look into this particular question. Who among the following was appointed as the Governor General of India? So, or in other words, who among the following was the first Governor General of India? Is it Lord Cornwallis, Lord Warren Hastings, Lord William Bentinck, or is it none of the above? If you know the answers, you can put the answers in the comment box. So with that, we are coming to the end of our lecture number 4, where we basically try to understand as to what has happened during the company rule. So we have seen all the major developments and the summary of what has happened during the company rule. So in our next lecture, we'll start with what has happened during the crown rule, which is even more important for your examination, which we'll start it in the next class. And before I wind up the lecture, if you like this lecture, you can also refer this channel to your friends and family members who are preparing for the UPSC examination or other competitive examination. And I'm very sure that it will be really beneficial to all those students who are watching these lectures. And if you want to reach out to me, you can reach out to me through my Telegram channel or through my Instagram account. Thank you very much for watching this lecture. All the very best. Thank you.